In a struggling town, 17-year-old Ethan Brooks is caught between his dreams and his harsh reality. With his parents gone, he works tirelessly to care for his bright, imaginative younger sister, Lila, while juggling school and a part-time job at a hardware store. The weight of overdue bills, the looming threat of eviction, and the relentless pressure to make ends meet threaten to crush his spirit. But when an act of kindness helping a stranded driver with a broken car leads to an unexpected job opportunity, Ethan's life takes an unexpected turn. With the support of his boss, a generous mechanic, and a community that believes in him, Ethan begins a journey to reshape his future. However, it's not without challenges. Balancing school, work, and home life forces him to confront self-doubt, exhaustion, and the fear of failure. Ethan Brooks pushed the apartment door open with his shoulder, balancing a paper bag of groceries in one arm. The hinges creaked loudly as the door swung inward, revealing the cramped, dimly lit living room he shared with his 10-year-old sister, Lila. The small couch sagged in the middle, a hand-me-down from their neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who had insisted they take it when she bought a new one. "Lila," Ethan called, setting the bag down on the chipped counter in the adjacent kitchenette. "Here," came her voice from the corner of the room. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, her face illuminated by the weak glow of a desk lamp. She was hunched over a notebook, her tongue poking out as she carefully colored in a drawing. Ethan smiled despite the heaviness in his chest. "What are you working on?" She held up the paper, revealing a vibrant picture of a house surrounded by flowers. Stick-figure versions of Ethan and Lila stood out front, smiling brightly. "It's our future house. When we have a yard, I'm planting all the flowers I can." Ethan crouched beside her, brushing her hair back gently. "It's beautiful, Lila," he said. But inside, the weight of reality pressed harder. Their apartment was far from the cheerful scene she had drawn. The wallpaper was peeling, the heater barely worked, and the fridge rattled ominously whenever it ran. Standing, Ethan pulled a carton of milk from the bag and set it in the fridge, careful not to jostle the other items too much. He knew every penny of his paycheck was accounted for, and wasting food was not an option. The rest of the bag held discounted bread, a few cans of soup, and a small box of cereal for Lila. "What's for dinner?" she asked, setting the drawing aside and walking over. "Soup," Ethan replied, pouring water into a pot and setting it on their worn-out stovetop. He stirred absently as his mind drifted to their growing list of problems. The most urgent was taped to the fridge in bold, unforgiving red, a utility shut-off notice. Electricity and heat were luxuries they couldn't afford to lose, especially with winter just weeks away. His boss at the grocery store had warned him earlier that day about reduced hours. "Things are slow," Mr. Harding had said with a shrug, as if that made it any less devastating. "Lila," Ethan said softly, "did you finish your homework?" She nodded, reaching for the cereal box he had just unpacked. "Can I have some?" "After dinner," he said, forcing a smile. He didn't want her to see his worry. As the soup warmed, Ethan thought about his next steps. Dropping out of high school had crossed his mind more than once. He was only a few months from graduating, but the pressure to find more work was growing every day. The idea of leaving school to work full-time made his stomach twist, but what choice did he have? Lila needed him. Later that night, after Lila had fallen asleep in their shared bedroom, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, a pile of bills spread before him. The numbers blurred as he stared at them, his head in his hands. The grocery store paycheck barely covered rent, and once the utility bill came due, they'd be in real trouble. The sound of footsteps startled him. Mrs. Carter appeared in the doorway, holding a steaming mug of tea. She had a key to their apartment, something Ethan had never questioned but now appreciated. "You're burning the midnight oil again," she said, placing the mug in front of him. Ethan sighed. "I can't figure out how to make it all work." Mrs. Carter pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Her weathered face was kind, though her eyes held a deep sadness. She had been a lifeline for them after their parents passed, helping as much as her own fixed income allowed. "You're doing the best you can," she said. "That's all anyone can ask." "It doesn't feel like enough," Ethan admitted. "Lila deserves better." "She's got you," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "That counts for a lot." Ethan nodded. though the reassurance did little to lighten the burden on his shoulders. The next morning, Ethan woke early and left for school before Lila stirred. He had math homework due, but it sat unfinished in his bag. He couldn't focus on algebra when their lights might not be on next week. At school, his teacher's words were sharper than usual. "Ethan, you're a bright student, but you're falling behind. You can't just coast through the rest of the semester." Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted to explain, to tell her about the utility bills and his reduced hours, but what would it change? Instead, he mumbled, "I'll try harder." At lunch, he sat alone, poking at the sandwich he had hastily thrown together that morning. He overheard a group of kids laughing nearby. "Hey, Brooks," one called, "lose a fight with your backpack?" Ethan ignored them, though his jaw tightened. His faded clothes and worn-out sneakers made him an easy target. The duct tape on his left shoe had peeled away again, and he made a mental note to fix it after work. That evening, Ethan arrived at the grocery store and threw on his apron. The hours dragged by as he stocked shelves, his mind elsewhere. When his shift ended, he stepped into the crisp night air and mounted his rusted bike. The cold bit through his thin jacket as he pedaled toward home. About halfway there, he spotted a car pulled to the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, and a man stood nearby, looking frustrated. Ethan hesitated, weighing his options. He was tired, but something compelled him to stop. "Need help?" Ethan called, rolling to a stop. The man looked up, startled. He was older, with gray hair and a weary expression. "I've got a flat," he said, holding up his phone. "Can't get through to a tow truck." Ethan leaned his bike against a nearby tree and approached. "I can take a look," he offered. The man raised an eyebrow. "You know what you're doing?" "Sort of," Ethan replied. He wasn't a mechanic, but he'd watched enough videos online to manage a basic tire change. He worked quickly, retrieving the spare tire from the man's trunk and swapping it out. His hands were cold and grimy by the time he finished, but the man's car was back in working order. "You didn't have to do that," the man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Let me pay you." Ethan shook his head. "It's fine. Just glad I could help." The man hesitated before extending his hand. "Sam Hargrove," he said. "Thank you, really." "Ethan Brooks," he replied, shaking Sam's hand. "Well, Ethan, you got a good heart," Sam said. "Not many people would stop to help a stranger." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's no big deal." Sam smiled faintly. "Maybe not to you, but it is to me." As Ethan rode home, he felt a small flicker of pride. For once, he'd been able to solve a problem, even if it wasn't his own. When Ethan got home, Lila was waiting for him at the table, her drawings spread out in front of her. She looked up with a grin. "I added a swing set," she said, pointing to the picture. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. "It looks perfect." But as he stared at the drawing, the weight of their reality settled over him again. Lila deserved a future as bright as the colors on that page. Ethan just wasn't sure how he'd make it happen. The morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds in the kitchen, casting thin rays of light onto the table. Ethan sipped a lukewarm cup of coffee, his thoughts tangled in the events of the previous night. Fixing that man's tire hadn't solved his problems, but it was the first time in a while he'd felt capable of handling something. Still, the flicker of pride was quickly snuffed out as he glanced at the utility notice still taped to the fridge. Lila shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Her hair was a mess of tangles, and her pajamas were a little too small, something else Ethan hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. "Good morning," he said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Breakfast?" She nodded, sliding into a chair. Ethan grabbed the cereal box from the counter, pouring what little was left into a bowl and adding just enough milk to cover it. Lila didn't complain, but he noticed how her spoon scraped the bottom after just a few bites. "You have a big day at school today?" he asked. "Not really," she replied, her voice small. She poked at the cereal before adding, "My teacher wants to talk to you." Ethan froze. "About what?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know. Maybe about my math test. I didn't do so good." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Another thing to add to his list. "It's okay, Lila. I'll talk to her. Just do your best, okay?" She nodded, her eyes downcast. The guilt clawed at Ethan's chest. She was carrying more than a kid her age should, and he hated that he couldn't shield her from it. Ethan pedaled to school, his bike rattling over the uneven pavement. The wind stung his face, and his thin jacket did little to block out the chill. As he chained his bike to the rack outside, he noticed a group of kids gathered near the entrance. One of them, a tall boy with a varsity jacket, shot Ethan a mocking glance. "Hey, Brooks," the boy called, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nice ride. Planning to trade it in for a real bike anytime soon?" The group erupted in laughter, and Ethan's jaw tightened. He kept his head down, walking quickly toward the school's front doors. It wasn't worth the fight. Inside, the halls buzzed with chatter as students prepared for the day. Ethan slipped into his first class, math, and sank into a seat near the back. His teacher, Mrs. Davis, wasted no time launching into a lecture about linear equations. Ethan tried to focus, but his mind wandered. He glanced at his unfinished homework, scribbled half-heartedly in his notebook, and sighed. The warning she'd given him yesterday echoed in his mind. "Ethan," Mrs. Davis said, pulling him from his thoughts, "can you solve this equation?" The room went silent as every head turned toward him. His stomach churned. He stared at the problem on the board, the numbers swimming in front of him. I don't know," he muttered. Mrs. Davis frowned, but moved on without pressing him. Ethan sank lower in his seat, heat rising in his cheeks. The rest of the class passed in a blur of humiliation. When the final bell rang, Ethan headed straight to work, bypassing the group of kids who always seemed to be waiting to make another comment. The grocery store felt colder than usual as he threw on his apron and clocked in. He had barely started stocking shelves when Mr. Harding, the store manager, approached. "Ethan," Harding said, his voice brisk, "I need to cut your hours again. Sales are down, and we have to make some changes." Ethan stared at him, the weight of those words sinking in. "But I need those hours." Harding shrugged. "Sorry, kid. Nothing I can do." Ethan wanted to argue, to beg, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded stiffly and turned back to the shelf, his chest tight. After work, Ethan rode home slowly, his mind racing. The reduced hours meant the utility bill was officially out of reach. He couldn't tell Lila not yet. She had enough to worry about. As he approached their building, he spotted Mrs. Carter on her balcony, watering a row of potted plants. She waved him over. "Evening, Ethan," she said. "You look like you've had a long day." Ethan sighed, resting his bike against the railing. "Yeah, work's cutting my hours. I don't know how we're going to manage." Mrs. Carter frowned, her watering can pause mid-pour. "That's tough, honey. You're already doing so much. Something's got to give." "I can't drop school," Ethan said firmly. "But I don't know what else to do." She set the watering can down and rested a hand on his shoulder. "Have you thought about asking for help? From anyone?" Ethan shook his head. "No one's going to help us, Mrs. Carter. People don't just do that." She gave him a look, equal parts stern and gentle. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes kindness comes when you least expect it." Ethan didn't reply. He wanted to believe her, but it felt naive. The world didn't hand out miracles. The next morning, Ethan was running late for school. He grabbed his bag and rushed out the door, nearly colliding with a car parked awkwardly at the curb. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized the driver. Sam Hargrove rolled down the window, smiling faintly. "Ethan Brooks," he said. "Fancy meeting you again." Ethan blinked. "Mr. Hargrove? What are you doing here?" Sam stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "I went back to the grocery store to thank you, but your boss said you were off. I asked around and found out you lived here." Ethan stared, unsure how to respond. "You didn't have to do that." Sam chuckled. "I wanted to. You went out of your way to help me, and I appreciated it." He paused, his expression softening. "Look, I run a hardware shop in town. It's small, but I could use an extra set of hands. If you're looking for work, the offer's there." Ethan's mind raced. A new job? One that might pay better? It sounded too good to be true. "I don't know. I've already got a lot on my plate." Sam nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. No pressure. But if you change your mind, stop by the shop. Here's my card." He handed Ethan a small, neatly printed card before climbing back into his car. As Sam drove away, Ethan stood there, the card clutched tightly in his hand. For the first time in a long while, it felt like a door had cracked open. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, turning the card over in his hands. Lila sat nearby, sketching another picture. This time it was a playground complete with swings and a slide. "You're quiet," she said, glancing up. "Just thinking," Ethan replied. "About what?" He hesitated, then showed her the card. "A man I helped the other night offered me a job." Lila's eyes lit up. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "It might be too much to handle." Lila set her pencil down, her expression serious. "You should do it. You're always saying we have to try, right?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I guess I did say that." And as he stared at the card again, the thought grew louder in his mind. Maybe Mrs. Carter was right. Maybe kindness really did come when you least expected it. Ethan stared at Sam's card on the kitchen table. The plain black lettering against the white cardstock looked almost too clean, too professional. He traced the embossed name with his fingers. Sam Hargrove. Owner, Hargrove Hardware. It felt unreal, like someone offering a rope when you were already chest-deep in quicksand. "Are you going to call him?" Lila asked, her voice soft. She was seated across from him, her small hands cradling a mug of hot cocoa Mrs. Carter had brought over earlier. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, leaning back in his chair. "It might be too much. I already have school, the grocery store, and everything else." Lila tilted her head. "But didn't your boss say they were cutting your hours?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, then maybe this is a good thing," she said with the simple wisdom of a child. Mr. Hargrove seemed nice. Ethan sighed, glancing at the stack of bills sitting on the counter. The utility shut-off notice loomed on top, glaring at him with its bold, unforgiving letters. He thought about their landlord's warning last week about late rent. He didn't have the luxury of waiting for things to get better. "I'll call him tomorrow," Ethan said finally. The next morning, Ethan woke early, the sunlight spilling weakly through the blinds. Lila was still asleep, curled up under a threadbare blanket in their shared bedroom. He didn't want to wake her, so he tiptoed into the kitchen and reached for the old landline phone mounted on the wall. Sam's card sat on the counter. Ethan dialed the number and pressed the receiver to his ear. His palms felt clammy as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hargrove Hardware, this is Sam speaking," came the familiar voice. Ethan cleared his throat. "Hi, Mr. Hargrove. It's Ethan. Ethan Brooks." "Ethan," Sam's tone brightened. "Good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I was wondering if the job offer was still open," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Absolutely," Sam replied. "Can you come by this afternoon? We'll go over everything and see if it's a good fit." "Yeah, I can do that," Ethan said, relief mixing with nervousness. "Great. I'll see you then," Sam said before hanging up. Ethan hung the phone back on the wall and took a deep breath. It felt like a small step forward, but even small steps could feel like climbing a mountain. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Ethan had pedaled his rusty bike across town to Hargrove Hardware. The store was small but inviting, its large front windows displaying neatly arranged tools, paint cans, and gardening supplies. A bell jingled as Ethan pushed the door open. Sam stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled up and a welcoming smile on his face. "Ethan, glad you made it," he said, motioning him over. Ethan walked to the counter, still a little unsure of himself. "Thanks for having me." Sam leaned on the counter, his demeanor relaxed. "So, here's the deal. I could use some help with restocking shelves, cleaning, and assisting customers. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work, and I'll pay you fairly. Sound good?" Ethan nodded quickly. "Yeah, that sounds good." Sam grinned. "Perfect. Why don't I show you around?" The tour was brief, but thorough. Sam walked Ethan through the aisles, pointing out where things were stocked and explaining how to use the register. Ethan listened intently, soaking up every detail. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was stepping into something that could actually lead somewhere. That evening, Ethan rode home, the crisp autumn air biting at his cheeks. Despite the chill, he felt lighter, as if some of the weight pressing down on him had eased. When he walked into the apartment, Lila was waiting on the couch, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "How was it?" she asked, sitting up straight. "It was good," Ethan said, setting his bag down. "I start tomorrow." Lila beamed. "I knew you'd get it." Ethan ruffled her hair. You're always so sure about everything. Someone has to be, she teased. He chuckled, the sound foreign but welcome. For a moment, it felt like things might actually be okay. The next day, Ethan arrived at the hardware store for his first shift. Sam greeted him warmly and handed him a work apron with the store's logo printed on it. You'll do great, Sam said, clapping him on the shoulder. Just take your time and ask if you're not sure about something. Ethan nodded, tying the apron around his waist. He started with simple tasks, stacking boxes, arranging tools, and sweeping the floor. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt good to do something productive. Throughout the day, customers came and went, some with detailed questions about products and others just browsing. Ethan watched as Sam patiently helped each one, offering advice and solutions with a calm confidence that Ethan admired. Around midday, a frazzled woman came in, holding a broken light fixture. I need this fixed, she said, placing it on the counter. But I have no idea what I'm doing. Sam glanced at Ethan. Think you can handle this one? Ethan hesitated but nodded. He examined the fixture carefully, checking the wiring and the socket. I think you just need a replacement bulb and maybe a new socket cap, he said. The woman smiled. Thank you. Can you show me where to find those? Ethan led her to the right aisle, helping her pick out what she needed. As she checked out, she looked at Sam and said, You've got a sharp one here. Sam grinned. I know. Ethan's face warmed at the compliment, but he couldn't help feeling proud. By the end of the week, Ethan had settled into a routine. He would go to school in the morning, work a shift at the hardware store in the afternoon, and spend his evenings helping Lila with her homework or tackling their endless pile of bills. It was exhausting, but it felt purposeful. One evening, as Ethan was locking up the store, Sam approached him with a thoughtful expression. You've been doing great, Ethan, he said. I can tell you're a hard worker. Thanks, Ethan said, feeling a little awkward. Sam crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. You know, I started out just like you. I worked in a place like this when I was a kid, learned everything I could, and eventually I opened this shop. Ethan looked at him, surprised. Really? Sam nodded. Hard work and a little help can take you far. I see that same drive in you. Ethan didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said something like that to him before. It stirred something inside him, a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Lila, who was drawing while he balanced their budget. She looked up suddenly and said, You're smiling. I am not, Ethan said, though he realized he was. You are, she insisted. It's nice. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they were heading in the right direction. The morning air was brisk as Ethan unlocked the hardware store's front door. It was his second week on the job, and though he still felt out of place sometimes, he had begun settling into the rhythm of the work. The steady hum of activity, the smell of sawdust and paint, and the quiet satisfaction of helping customers, it was a far cry from the chaos and judgment he often faced elsewhere. Morning, Ethan, Sam greeted as he entered from the back room, a clipboard in hand. His voice was warm, steady, and always carried the reassurance that Ethan had made the right decision to work here. Morning, Ethan replied, tying his apron around his waist. Got a delivery coming in later, Sam said. I'll need you to help with inventory, but first there's a customer waiting outside. Says it's urgent. Ethan frowned. The store hadn't even officially opened yet. Sure, I'll handle it. He flipped the sign on the door to open and stepped outside. A woman stood near the curb, leaning on an old, battered sedan. She looked to be in her mid-30s, her hair pulled into a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes. The car's hood was propped open, and a thin wisp of smoke drifted from the engine. You're open early, she said, sounding both relieved and embarrassed. Thank you. My car won't start, and I don't know what to do. Someone told me you all might have what I need. Ethan glanced at the engine. He wasn't a mechanic, but he'd learned enough from YouTube videos and quick fixes on his bike to recognize the basics. Mind if I take a look? The woman hesitated, then nodded. Please. I've got to pick up my daughter from school, and I'm already late for work. Ethan leaned over the engine, examining the belts and hoses. Your alternator belt's worn out. That's probably why your battery isn't holding a charge. Can you fix it? She asked, her voice trembling with desperation. I can get you the belt and tools you'll need. Ethan said, thinking quickly. It's not too hard to replace. Can you show me how? She asked, her voice almost pleading. I've never done anything like this before. Ethan nodded. Sure. Give me a second. A few minutes later, Ethan returned with a replacement belt and a toolkit. He worked methodically, explaining each step as he showed her how to remove the old belt and fit the new one in place. Her hands shook as she tried to follow his instructions, but Ethan remained patient, guiding her through the process. By the time they finished, the car's engine purred to life. The woman let out a relieved laugh, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her stress lifted. You're a lifesaver, she said, her eyes glistening. How much do I owe you? Ethan shook his head. It's nothing. Just glad I could help. The woman stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. Seriously? No one does anything for free these days. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. It's fine. Really? Well, thank you, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. I don't even know your name. Ethan, he said. And you're welcome. I'm Amanda, she said, smiling faintly. You're a good kid, Ethan. The world could use more people like you. Back inside, Sam watched from the counter as Ethan returned the tools to their proper place. Nice work out there, he said, his tone light but approving. She needed help. Ethan replied simply. Sam nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's a rare thing, stepping up for strangers like that. Keep it up. Ethan didn't respond, but a quiet pride settled in his chest. That evening, Ethan arrived home to find Lila at the kitchen table, coloring another picture. This one showed a shiny car parked outside a house with a yard full of flowers. She glanced up and grinned when she saw him. You're home early, she said. Yeah, Sam let me leave after the delivery was sorted. Ethan replied, dropping his bag near the door. What are you working on now? Lila held up the drawing proudly. It's your car, for when you get one. Ethan laughed, sitting beside her. That's a long way off. Maybe not, she said, her tone stubborn. You're working so hard, Ethan. It's going to happen. Ethan ruffled her hair, warmth blooming in his chest despite the lingering doubt. Maybe, he said, his voice softer. One day. The next morning, Ethan's routine was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Carter wasn't due to visit, and no one else ever stopped by. He opened the door cautiously and was surprised to see Amanda standing there, holding a plate covered in foil. I hope this isn't weird, she said, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. But I wanted to thank you for helping me yesterday. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said, smiling warmly. But you didn't have to help me either. So here, it's lasagna. My daughter and I made it last night. Ethan hesitated, glancing back toward the kitchen where Lila was working on her homework. Thank you, he said finally, taking the plate. That's really kind of you. It's the least I could do, Amanda said. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. She left before Ethan could say anything else, leaving him standing in the doorway with the warm plate in his hands. What's that? Lila called from the kitchen. Dinner, Ethan said, setting the plate on the counter. He peeled back the foil, revealing the perfectly baked lasagna. The smell alone made his stomach growl. Who gave it to you? Lila asked, peering over his shoulder. A woman I helped at work, Ethan replied. She wanted to say thank you. That's so nice, Lila said, her eyes wide. Can we eat it now? Ethan chuckled. Let me heat it up first. As they sat down to eat, Ethan couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. For so long, it felt like the world had only taken from them. Now, for the first time, it felt like something was giving back. The next day at the hardware store, Sam handed Ethan a clipboard with the week's inventory list. I'm giving you more responsibility, he said with a grin. Think you can handle it? Ethan nodded, determination sparking in his eyes. I can handle it. Good, Sam said. You've got potential, Ethan. Don't waste it. As Ethan set to work, his mind drifted to Amanda's unexpected kindness, to the lasagna that had made him and Lila feel full in more ways than one. Maybe Sam was right. Maybe potential wasn't something you were born with, it was something you grew into one step at a time. Ethan's days at the hardware store were becoming a routine he could rely on. Every morning after school, he tied on his apron, greeted Sam, and threw himself into tasks with quiet determination. The work kept his hands busy and his mind focused, and for once he felt like he was making progress. It was a Thursday afternoon when Sam called Ethan into the back office. The room was small and cluttered, its walls lined with shelves of dusty ledgers and repair manuals. Sam sat behind the desk, his sleeves rolled up as usual, looking over some papers. "Take a seat, Ethan," he said, gesturing to the worn chair across from him. Ethan sat, suddenly nervous. Had he done something wrong? Was Sam about to tell him the store couldn't afford to keep him? Sam smiled, as if sensing Ethan's worry. "Relax. You're not in trouble." Quite the opposite, actually. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Oh, okay." Sam leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. "I've been watching you these past few weeks. You got a strong work ethic, Ethan. You're reliable, you listen, and you've got a good head on your shoulders." Ethan felt his cheeks flush. "Thanks. I wanted to talk to you about something," Sam continued. "Have you ever thought about learning a trade? Something beyond what you're doing here?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. I mean, I like working here, but I never thought about it as a long-term thing." Sam nodded. "That's fair. But I think you've got potential, Ethan. A lot of potential. And I've got a friend who runs a vocational training program over at the community college. It's for things like automotive repair, carpentry, and electrical work. If you're interested, I could help you get started." Ethan's stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and fear. The idea of learning a trade, of having a real career, felt almost too good to be true. "I don't know," he said quietly. "School's already hard enough, and I still have to work and take care of Lila." Sam gave him a steady look. "I get it. It's a lot to juggle, but think about where this could lead. You've got people who believe in you, Ethan. Don't let fear hold you back." Ethan nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. "I'll think about it." "Good," Sam said, standing and extending a hand. "That's all I'm asking." That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Lila, a pile of math homework in front of him. She was working on a drawing, her pencil scratching softly against the paper. "Do you think I'd be good at fixing cars?" Ethan asked suddenly. Lila looked up, her eyes wide. "Why? Are you going to fix ours?" "We don't have a car," Ethan said, chuckling. "Not yet," she said, grinning. "But maybe one day." Ethan smiled, her optimism contagious. "Sam said I could take classes to learn about stuff like that. He thinks I'd be good at it." "Sam's really smart," Lila said matter-of-factly. "If he thinks you can do it, you can." Ethan laughed softly. "You make it sound so easy." "It is," Lila said, as if it were obvious. "You're already good at fixing things. You fix my stuff all the time." Ethan felt a swell of warmth at her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe he could do this. The next day at work, Ethan approached Sam. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About the training program." Sam's face lit up. "Yeah, I think I'd like to try it," Ethan said, though his voice wavered slightly. Sam clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Let me make a call." A week later, Ethan found himself standing outside the community college's vocational training center. The building was modern and well-kept, its large glass doors reflecting the gray clouds overhead. Sam had driven him here, offering words of encouragement during the short ride. "You'll do great," Sam said as they stepped inside. "Just keep an open mind." Inside, Ethan was greeted by a man named Mr. Douglas, the program coordinator. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Ethan of Sam. "So, you're the kid Sam's been talking up?" Mr. Douglas said, his sharp eyes appraising Ethan. "He's got good instincts. Let's see if he's right." The tour was brief, but thorough. Ethan was shown the automotive repair lab, the carpentry workshop, and the electrical training center. The equipment was far more advanced than anything Ethan had ever seen, and it made him feel both intimidated and exhilarated. "This is where you'll start," Mr. Douglas said, gesturing to the automotive bay. "We'll teach you the basics first, how to diagnose problems, replace parts, and handle tools safely. From there, it's up to you how far you want to take it." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the opportunity. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You'll earn it," Mr. Douglas replied. "Class starts next week. Don't be late." That night, Ethan told Lila about the program. She listened intently, her face lighting up as he described the automotive lab. "Does this mean you'll be a mechanic?" she asked. "Maybe," Ethan said. If I'm good at it, you'll be great, she said confidently. Ethan smiled, her faith in him steadying his nerves. Thanks, Lila. The following week, Ethan began his first class. The lecture hall was small but full of energy, with students ranging from fresh-faced teens to older adults looking to switch careers. Ethan found a seat near the back, his notebook and pen ready. The instructor, a middle-aged man with a booming voice, introduced himself as Mr. Carter. He wasted no time diving into the fundamentals of engine mechanics. This is not an easy class, Mr. Carter warned. But if you put in the effort, you'll come out of here with skills that can change your life. Ethan took notes furiously, his hand cramping as he tried to keep up. By the end of the lecture, his head was spinning, but he felt a small flicker of pride. He had survived his first day. At the hardware store, Sam was eager to hear about Ethan's experience. How'd it goes? He asked as they unloaded a shipment of lumber. It was tough, Ethan admitted, but I think I learned a lot. That's how it's supposed to be, Sam said. Keep at it, and you'll do fine. Ethan nodded, his confidence growing. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was building something not just for himself, but for Lila too. Later that evening, Ethan sat with Lila as she finished her homework. The utility notice was still taped to the fridge, but for once, it didn't feel like the center of his world. He was taking steps, little by little, to make things better. Lila glanced up, her brow furrowed. You're smiling again. Am I? Ethan asked, surprised. Yeah, she said, grinning. You should do it more. Ethan laughed, the sound feeling lighter than it had in years. Maybe he would. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack as he stepped out of the community college building. The afternoon sun was warm against his face, cutting through the crisp autumn air. His first week in the vocational program had been a blur of lectures, practical demonstrations, and late nights studying in the dim light of the kitchen while Lila slept. It was exhausting, but it felt worth it. The ride to the hardware store wasn't long, and as he pedaled his bike past rows of small houses and corner stores, Ethan thought about everything he'd learned in just a few days. Terms like compression ratio and torque floated through his mind. It wasn't just theory either. He'd already worked on an engine in the school's lab, his hands greasy as he carefully followed the instructor's guidance. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. At the hardware store, Sam greeted him with a grin. How's my student doing? Tired, Ethan admitted, setting his backpack down behind the counter. But good. I think I'm starting to get it. Sam chuckled. That's how it goes. You'll feel like you're drowning at first, but then one day it'll click. Ethan nodded, tying on his apron. I hope so. You're already ahead of the game, Sam said. Not everyone has the drive to work, study, and keep things together at home like you do. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I don't really have a choice. Sure you do, Sam said, his tone firm. A lot of people would give up. You didn't. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he busied himself straightening the tools on the counter. Sam's words stuck with him, though, replaying in his mind as he stocked shelves and helped customers throughout the afternoon. Later that evening, Ethan unlocked the door to their apartment and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of canned soup. Lila was at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Hey, she said, looking up. How was school? Good, Ethan replied, setting his bag down. How about you? Lila shrugged. Okay, I got AB on my math test. Nice job, Ethan said, ruffling her hair as he passed. That's better than I could have done. She giggled, then turned serious. Are you hungry? Mrs. Carter brought over soup and bread. She said you need to eat more. Ethan smirked. She's probably right. He heated up a bowl and joined Lila at the table. As they ate, she asked questions about his classes, her curiosity unending. Ethan tried his best to explain the basics of engines and diagnostics, and Lila listened with wide-eyed fascination. Do you think you'll fix cars one day? She asked. Maybe, Ethan said. If I'm good enough. You will be, she said confidently. You're good at everything. Ethan laughed softly. Not everything. Almost everything, she insisted. Her belief in him was humbling, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He was trying so hard to build a future for them, but what if he failed? He couldn't bear the thought of letting her down. The next week, Ethan's routine became more intense. Mornings were spent at school, afternoons at the hardware store, and evenings at home with Lila. The days blurred together in a whirlwind of responsibility, but Ethan began to see the rewards of his efforts. One afternoon, a customer came into the store with a question about replacing a spark plug. Sam had stepped out for a delivery, leaving Ethan alone to handle it. "I don't really know what I'm doing," the man admitted, holding the old spark plug in his hand. "But I figured I'd try to fix it myself before taking it to a shop." Ethan examined the spark plug, noting the blackened tip and worn surface. "You'll need a new one," he said, leading the man to the correct aisle. "It's not too hard to replace. Just make sure the engine's cool, and use a spark plug socket to install it snugly." The man looked at him, surprised. "You sound like you know what you're talking about." Ethan shrugged, trying to hide the pride creeping into his chest. "I'm learning." The man smiled. "Thanks, kid. I appreciate it." As the man checked out, Ethan couldn't help but feel a small surge of confidence. Maybe he really was starting to get the hang of this. At school, Ethan's instructors began to take notice of his dedication. One evening, after a particularly challenging lab session, Mr. Carter pulled him aside. "You've got a good eye for this, Ethan," Mr. Carter said. "Have you thought about where you want to go after this program?" Ethan hesitated. "Not really. I'm just trying to get through it right now." "Well, keep at it," Mr. Carter said. "You've got potential. Don't waste it." The word potential stuck with Ethan as he rode home that night. It was the same thing Sam had said, and hearing it again made him wonder if they were right. Maybe he wasn't just scraping by anymore. Maybe he was building something real. One evening, as Ethan and Lila sat on the couch watching an old cartoon on their tiny television, there was a knock at the door. Ethan frowned. They rarely had visitors besides Mrs. Carter, and she usually let herself in. He opened the door to find Amanda, the woman whose car he'd helped fix outside the hardware store. She held a casserole dish covered in foil and smiled sheepishly. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you again for helping me the other day. You really saved me." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Amanda said, handing him the dish. "But you did something kind for me, and I wanted to return the favor. It's chicken and rice. I hope you like it." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice quieter. "That's really nice of you." Amanda smiled. "Kindness goes both ways, Ethan. Don't forget that." As she left, Ethan set the dish on the counter, still processing the unexpected gesture. Lila peeked around the corner, her eyes wide. "Who was that?" "Just someone from work," Ethan said. "She brought us dinner." Lila grinned. "See? You're already making a difference." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe." As they sat down to eat, Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like he wasn't walking it alone. Ethan's days had taken on a rhythm. School in the morning, work at the hardware store in the afternoon, and evenings spent studying or helping Lila with her homework. It wasn't easy, and most nights he collapsed in a bed exhausted, but there was a steady sense of purpose propelling him forward. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his efforts were building towards something real. Still, the pressure of balancing everything was starting to take its toll. His homework was piling up, the demands of his vocational program were increasing, and the shifts at the hardware store left little time to catch his breath. Even Lila had begun to notice. "You look tired," she said one evening as Ethan slumped onto the couch after dinner. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe you should take a break," she said softly, sitting beside him. "I can't," Ethan said, shaking his head. "There's too much to do." "You can't do everything," Lila pointed out, her voice firm despite her small frame. "You're not a superhero." Ethan smiled faintly, ruffling her hair. "I don't need to be a superhero. I just need to keep us going." Lila frowned, but didn't argue. Ethan appreciated her concern, but she didn't understand. Stopping wasn't an option. The next day, Ethan's exhaustion caught up to him at school. During his math class, he found his eyes drooping as Mrs. Davis droned on about equations. He startled awake just as the bell rang, realizing with dread that he hadn't taken any notes. "Ethan," Mrs. Davis called as he gathered his things. "Can I see you for a moment?" He approached her desk reluctantly, clutching his notebook. "I've noticed you've been struggling lately," she said, her tone gentle but concerned. Your grades have dropped, and you're not participating in class. Is everything okay? Ethan hesitated. I'm just busy. I'll catch up, I promise. Mrs. Davis sighed. You're a bright student, Ethan, but you can't keep going like this. If you need help, ask for it. I'll be fine, Ethan said, his voice firm. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he didn't want anyone else worrying about him. That afternoon, Sam called Ethan into the office. Ethan's stomach tightened as he stepped inside, wondering if he'd done something wrong. Have a seat, Sam said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ethan sat, bracing himself. I've noticed you've been a little off lately, Sam said, leaning back in his chair. Is everything okay? Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to complain, especially to someone who had given him so many opportunities. I'm just trying to keep up with everything, he admitted finally. Schoolwork, Lila? It's a lot. Sam nodded, his expression understanding. That's a lot for anyone, Ethan. You're doing a great job, but you can't do everything at once. Sometimes you have to make tough choices. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? I mean you need to prioritize, Sam said. If you want to succeed in the program and build a future for yourself and Lila, you might have to cut back on other things. The thought of leaving the hardware store made Ethan's chest tighten. The job was more than just a paycheck. It was a place where he felt valued, a rare source of stability in his life. I can't quit, he said quickly. I need the money. I'm not saying quit, Sam said, but maybe cut back your hours. Focus on what matters most. Ethan nodded slowly, though the idea made him uneasy. The thought of earning less money felt dangerous, like pulling at a loose thread in an already fragile system. But Sam's words stuck with him. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his budget notebook. The numbers didn't lie. Cutting back on hours would mean tightening their already thin margins even further. But he thought about the vocational program, about what it could mean for their future. If he didn't give it his all, what was the point of even trying? What's wrong? Lila asked, sitting across from him with her sketch pad. Just figuring some things out, Ethan said, closing the notebook. He didn't want her to see how close they were to the edge. Is it about work? She asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan nodded. Yeah, Sam thinks I should work less so I can focus on school. Lila tilted her head. Isn't school more important? It is, Ethan said. But work pays the bills. Lila frowned, tapping her pencil against the table. You always say we have to try, right? Maybe this is one of those times. Ethan sighed, her simple logic cutting through his doubts. Maybe. The next day, Ethan approached Sam after his shift. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, his voice steady. About cutting back my hours. Sam nodded, waiting. I think I want to try it, Ethan said. Focus more on school and the program. A slow smile spread across Sam's face. That's the right choice, Ethan. I'll adjust the schedule. You'll still get a few shifts a week to keep some income. Thanks, Ethan said, relief and nervousness swirling in his chest. You're investing in your future, Sam said. And that's always worth it. The change wasn't easy. With fewer shifts, Ethan had to stretch every dollar even further. But he quickly realized how much more energy he had for his studies. At school, he began staying after class to ask questions, and his instructors noticed his renewed focus. You're making progress, Mr. Carter said after a particularly challenging lab session. Keep it up, and you'll do well here. Ethan nodded, feeling a spark of pride. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. At home, Lila continued to be his biggest cheerleader. One evening, as he helped her with her math homework, she grinned at him. You're doing so much better, Ethan. Thanks, he said, smiling back. So are you. She giggled, holding up her sketch pad. Do you think we'll get a house like this one day? Ethan looked at the drawing, another colorful masterpiece of a cozy home with a garden full of flowers. Yeah, he said softly. One day. And for the first time, he believed it. Ethan's decision to cut back his hours had been a leap of faith, one he was still trying to justify. As the days turned into weeks, the strain of a reduced paycheck began to show. The utility shut-off notice still hung on the fridge, an ever-present reminder of how close they were to losing the basics. Despite the pressure, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. He was finally putting everything he had into the vocational program, and for the first time, his grades were improving. At the hardware store, Sam continued to be supportive, offering encouragement and occasional tips from his years of experience. One afternoon, as Ethan was organizing a shipment of paint cans, Sam called him over. "There's someone I want you to meet," Sam said, motioning toward a man standing near the counter. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of quiet confidence. He extended a hand as Ethan approached. "Ethan, this is Ray," Sam said. "He's one of my oldest friends and runs a small repair shop downtown. Thought you two should connect." Ray shook Ethan's hand firmly. "Sam's been telling me about you," he said, his voice deep but kind. "Says you got a knack for fixing things." "I'm learning," Ethan said modestly. "That's how it starts," Ray said. "If you ever want some hands-on experience outside of school, swing by my shop. I can always use an extra set of hands." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Really? Really," Ray said. "It won't pay much, but you'll learn a lot." Sam clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "What do you think?" "I'd like that," Ethan said, excitement and nervousness mingling in his chest. "Good," Ray said. "Stop by next Saturday, and we'll get started." That evening, Ethan told Lila about the opportunity as they ate dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and canned sauce. "So now you'll have two jobs?" Lila asked, twirling her fork. "Not exactly," Ethan said. "It's more like an internship. I won't get paid much, but I'll learn a lot." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds good. You're going to be the best mechanic ever." Ethan laughed softly. "I've got a long way to go." "You'll get there," she said confidently. "You always do." The following Saturday, Ethan rode his bike to Ray's shop. The building was modest, its exterior weathered but tidy. Inside, the smell of oil and grease was thick in the air, and the sound of tools clinking against metal echoed through the space. Ray greeted him with a nod and handed him a pair of gloves. "Let's get to work," Ray said. Ethan spent the morning shadowing Ray, learning how to replace brake pads, change oil, and diagnose engine problems. The work was challenging but invigorating, and Ray's calm, patient teaching style made it easier to absorb the information. By the end of the day, Ethan's hands were sore and covered in grime, but he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Ray handed him a small envelope as he was leaving. "It's not much," Ray said, "but you earned it." Ethan opened the envelope later at home, finding a crisp $20 bill inside. It wasn't a lot, but it was something, and it gave him hope that he was on the right path. That evening, as Ethan was helping Lila with her homework, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Carter stood on the other side, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, handing it to Ethan. "It was in my mailbox by mistake." Ethan frowned, taking the envelope. There was no return address, just his name scrawled in neat handwriting. He opened it carefully, his breath catching as he pulled out a stack of bills, $50 in total. A note was tucked inside. "Kindness deserves kindness in return. Take care of yourself and your sister." Ethan stared at the note, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Lila asked, peeking over his shoulder. "Someone gave us money," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" Lila asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," Ethan said, his mind racing. The handwriting looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Mrs. Carter smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, good things come when you least expect them." The extra money was enough to pay the overdue utility bill, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he could breathe. As he sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at the paid receipt, he thought about the people who had helped him along the way: Sam, Amanda, Ray, and now this anonymous donor. Their kindness felt like a lifeline, pulling him and Lila through the toughest times. "You're smiling again," Lila said, her voice teasing. "I guess I am," Ethan said, laughing softly. "Good," she said, her tone turning serious. "You should do it more." Ethan reached across the table and ruffled her hair. "I'll try." The next week, Ethan returned to his routine with renewed focus. At the vocational program, he began to stand out, answering questions in class and volunteering for hands-on demonstrations. At the hardware store, customers began to ask for him by name, trusting his advice and appreciating his calm demeanor. One afternoon, as Ethan was finishing up at Ray's shop, Ray handed him a set of wrenches. "Consider these yours," Ray said, Every mechanic needs good tools. Ethan stared at the wrenches, his chest tightening. Thank you. Don't thank me, Ray said, his expression serious. Just keep working hard. You've got what it takes, Ethan. Ethan nodded, determination burning in his chest. I won't let you down. Later that evening, as Ethan and Lila sat on the couch watching TV, he glanced at the pile of bills on the counter. For the first time, they didn't feel like an impossible mountain. They were just another challenge to overcome one step at a time. Do you think things are getting better? Lila asked, leaning against his shoulder. Yeah, Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her. I think they are. And for the first time, he truly believed it. The morning sunlight streamed through the apartment's thin curtains as Ethan folded a freshly washed shirt and placed it into Lila's drawer. He glanced at the tidy rows of clothes he had carefully arranged. Though most of them were hand-me-downs, it felt good to make sure she had what she needed. It was a small thing, but it was something he could control. Lila bounced into the room, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. What are you doing? Cleaning up, Ethan said, brushing lint from his shirt. Your clothes were a mess. They weren't that bad, she said, rolling her eyes but smiling. Want to see what I drew? Ethan sat on the edge of the bed as Lila opened her sketchpad to reveal a colorful scene of a bustling garage. In the center was a stick-figure version of Ethan, wearing a mechanic's uniform, holding a wrench. Is that supposed to be me? Ethan asked, grinning. Yeah, you look cool, right? Lila said proudly. Very cool, Ethan replied, ruffling her hair. Maybe I'll even get a uniform like that someday. You will, Lila said firmly. You're already working so hard. Ethan smiled, her words echoing in his mind as he finished tidying up. Lila's faith in him was a constant source of motivation, and he was determined to make her vision of their future a reality. At the hardware store that afternoon, Sam approached Ethan with a clipboard. Got a minute? Sure, Ethan said, setting down the stack of paint cans he had been arranging. Sam handed him the clipboard, his grin widening. I've been keeping an eye on you, and I think it's time you took on a little more responsibility. Ethan blinked, surprised. Like what? Inventory management, Sam said. It's not just stocking shelves, it's keeping track of what comes in and what goes out, making sure we have what customers need. Ethan hesitated. It sounded like a big step, and he wasn't sure he was ready. Are you sure I can handle it? I wouldn't offer if I wasn't, Sam said. You've got a good head for details, and you've proven you're dependable. It's a natural next step. Ethan nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do my best. That's all I ask, Sam said, clapping him on the shoulder. The added responsibility kept Ethan busy, but he found that he enjoyed the challenge. The more he learned about how the store operated, the more confident he became. He started to see the connections between his work at the hardware store, his time at Ray's garage, and his classes at the vocational program. Bit by bit, he was building skills that could carry him far beyond the walls of either place. At school, his instructors began to notice his growing confidence. Mr. Carter called him out during a lecture on diagnostic systems. Ethan, Mr. Carter said, pointing to the diagram on the board, what's the first thing you'd check if an engine won't start? Ethan hesitated for only a moment before answering. The battery. Then the ignition system. Good, Mr. Carter said with an approving nod. You're starting to think like a mechanic. Ethan sat back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. The praise felt earned, and it bolstered his determination to keep going. One Saturday at Ray's garage, Ethan was working on a particularly tricky repair, a fuel pump replacement on an old sedan. The bolts were rusted, and the space was tight, making it hard to maneuver his tools. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he carefully loosened the last bolt, his hands steady despite the strain. You've got a good touch, Ray said, watching from nearby. Most people would have stripped those bolts by now. Thanks, Ethan said, sitting back and wiping his hands on a rag. It's harder than I thought it'd be. That's how you learn, Ray said. And you're doing great. Keep at it, and you'll be running your own shop someday. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. I don't know about that. I do, Ray said firmly. You've got what it takes. Just don't lose sight of where you're going. Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with pride. Ray's belief in him felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. That evening, Ethan and Lila celebrated the small victories with a homemade pizza they had cobbled together from whatever was left in the fridge. As they ate, Lila chattered about her day at school, her enthusiasm filling the tiny apartment with warmth. "Do you think we'll ever have a house with a big kitchen?" Lila asked, biting into her slice. "Someday," Ethan said. "But for now, we'll make this work." Lila grinned. "I can't wait." Ethan smiled, her optimism infectious. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right track. The following week brought an unexpected surprise. As Ethan was finishing up a repair at Ray's garage, a sleek black car pulled into the lot. The driver, a sharply dressed man in his 40s, stepped out and approached Ray. "Ray," the man said, extending a hand. "It's been a while." "Too long," Ray replied, shaking his hand. "What brings you here?" "I've got a job opening at my dealership," the man said. "I'm looking for someone with promise, someone willing to learn the ropes." Ray glanced at Ethan, a knowing smile on his face. "I think I've got just the person for you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Me?" "You," Ray said. "You've been working hard, and I think you're ready for the next step." The man handed Ethan a business card. "Come by on Monday and we'll talk." Ethan stared at the card, his mind racing. The opportunity felt almost too good to be true. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've earned it," Ray said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, Ethan shared the news with Lila. Her eyes lit up as she listened, her excitement palpable. "This is it," she said, practically bouncing in her seat. "You're going to be amazing." "I hope so," Ethan said, though a small smile played on his lips. He couldn't deny the spark of hope growing inside him. As Ethan lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he thought about how far they had come. The challenges hadn't disappeared, but he felt stronger, more capable of facing them. The kindness of people like Sam and Ray had given him the tools he needed to keep moving forward, and he wasn't going to waste them. For the first time, the future didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt like a door waiting to be opened. Monday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of day that hinted at change. Ethan adjusted the collar of his borrowed shirt, one of Sam's hand-me-downs, and took a deep breath. The business card from the dealership felt heavy in his pocket as he pedaled across town. His heart raced with a mix of nerves and anticipation. The dealership was impossible to miss. Its sleek glass facade reflected the bright morning sun, and rows of luxury cars gleamed like polished jewels in the lot. Ethan chained his bike to a post near the entrance, suddenly feeling out of place in his scuffed shoes and faded jacket. He pushed the thought aside and stepped inside. "Ethan Brooks," he said to the receptionist, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Caldwell." The receptionist smiled and directed him to a sleek waiting area. Minutes later, the sharply dressed man from the garage, Peter Caldwell, appeared, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. "Ethan, good to see you," Peter said. "Ray speaks highly of you." "Thank you," Ethan replied, grateful but nervous. Peter led him into a conference room and gestured for him to sit. "Let's get right to it. We're looking for someone willing to start at the bottom and work their way up. It'll be grunt work at first, cleaning, organizing, maybe some customer assistance. But if you're willing to learn, there's room to grow." "I'm willing," Ethan said firmly, meeting Peter's gaze. "Good," Peter said, nodding. "We'll start you part-time. Once you've proven yourself, we can talk about more opportunities. Sound fair?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said, feeling a surge of excitement. "Great. We'll see you here next Monday," Peter said, standing to shake his hand. Ethan walked out of the dealership with a new sense of purpose. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to turn everything he'd been working toward into something real. As he pedaled home, the wind whipping against his face, he couldn't stop the grin that spread across his lips. At home, Lila greeted him at the door, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Well?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "I got it," Ethan said, his grin widening. Lila let out a squeal of delight and threw her arms around him. "I knew you would." Ethan laughed, the sound light and free. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were winning. The week leading up to his first day at the dealership was a blur. Ethan balanced his classes, shifts at the hardware store, and time at Ray's garage with careful precision, determined not to let anything slip. His instructors at the vocational program continued to encourage him, praising his growing confidence and skill. "You're getting good at this, Ethan," Mr. Carter said during a lab session. "Keep it up, and you'll go far." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with pride. The words felt like fuel propelling him forward. On his first day at the dealership, Ethan arrived early, his nerves buzzing. The showroom was already bustling with activity, salespeople in sharp suits moving between cars and customers, the air humming with energy. Peter greeted him with a smile and handed him a uniform shirt. "Welcome to the team," Peter said. "Let's get started." Ethan's tasks were simple but important: cleaning cars, organizing tools, and ensuring the garage ran smoothly. The work was familiar, thanks to his time at Ray's shop and the hardware store, and he tackled each task with quiet determination. By the end of the day, Ethan was exhausted but satisfied. As he changed back into his jacket, Peter stopped by to check in. "Good work today," Peter said. "I can see why Ray recommended you." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Peter said, clapping him on the shoulder. "See you tomorrow." That evening, Ethan shared the day's events with Lila as they sat at the kitchen table eating sandwiches. "Did you meet anyone famous?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "Not yet," Ethan said, laughing. "But maybe someday." "You're going to be the best one there," Lila said confidently. Ethan smiled, her belief in him a constant source of strength. "I'll do my best." Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into his work at the dealership, learning as much as he could from the mechanics and sales staff. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. Peter began assigning him more responsibilities, and the senior mechanics started to involve him in more complex repairs. At the same time, Ethan continued excelling in his vocational program. His instructors praised his progress, and his classmates began turning to him for advice during lab sessions. "You're like a pro already," one of them said as Ethan demonstrated how to replace a timing belt. "Not yet," Ethan replied, grinning. "But I'm getting there." One Friday afternoon, Sam stopped by the dealership. Ethan was in the garage cleaning tools when he spotted his former boss leaning against the counter with a grin. Ethan called, setting down the wrench he'd been holding. "Thought I'd check in on my star employee," Sam said. "How's it going?" "Better than I ever thought it could," Ethan said, his smile genuine. "Thanks to you." Sam waved him off. "You did the work, Ethan. I just gave you a nudge." The two chatted for a while before Sam clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep it up. You're going places." That evening, Ethan and Lila celebrated with a small treat, a pint of ice cream they shared on the couch. Lila was drawing again. Her latest masterpiece, a picture of Ethan standing proudly in front of a shiny car. "You've got the details wrong," Ethan teased. "I'd never wear that tie." Lila giggled. "You will if you're the boss." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe someday." As the months went on, Ethan's hard work began to pay off. The dealership offered him a full-time apprenticeship, allowing him to earn while continuing his education. The utility bills were no longer a source of constant anxiety, and Ethan even managed to start saving a little each month. One evening, as Ethan tucked Lila into bed, she looked up at him with a sleepy smile. "Do you think we'll get our house soon?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yeah," Ethan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're getting closer every day." "Good," Lila murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "I can't wait." Ethan stood in the quiet kitchen, looking at the eviction notice that still hung on the fridge. It was a reminder of how far they had come. He took it down, folding it carefully before tucking it into a drawer. It wasn't something to forget, it was something to remember. He stared at the drawing Lila had left on the table, a picture of their future house surrounded by flowers. For the first time, it didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, and Ethan was ready to make it happen. If you've enjoyed this heartfelt story of perseverance, kindness, and hope, make sure to subscribe for more inspiring narratives like this one. Your support helps bring more meaningful stories to life. Don't forget to like, comment, and share with someone who could use a little inspiration today.